Where do people get this idea that the first humans were made around 6,000 years ago? The Bible says that God created Adam and Eve, but Genesis doesn't say in the year 4004 BC, God created the heavens and the earth. It just says in the beginning. How can we know when that beginning was? Or can we even know? If we look at the data and then apply some simple logic and math, we can figure it out. And I'd like to show you how. This part right here is Genesis chapter 5. It's one of those parts of the Bible that you're not likely to hear about in Sunday school or from your pastor. No one's going to share this on Instagram or Facebook because it's kind of boring and it contains a lot of data. But that data is how we can figure out when people were born, when they lived, and when they died. Let's take a look at this pattern. It says here that Adam lived 130 years and he had Seth. So following that pattern, after Adam, we see that Seth lived 105 years and had his son Enosh. Then he lived for another 807 years. He had other sons and daughters. So he was 912 years old when he died. Same pattern follows. His son lived 90 years and had another son. He lived another 815 years, and he died when he was 905 years old. So, does that make sense so far? Now I'm going to show you how we can chain all of these things together from Genesis 5 and later chapters and put it all on a timeline to figure out how they logically fit together. Remember, Adam lived 130 years and begat Seth, and the pattern continues on down through the generations. Now, as we follow this along, we can read each of the sections on this timeline, so Genesis 5:18. So, we keep going on down that line, down through Lamech and Noah. And then after Noah's flood, this vertical line right here, we see his descendants, Shem and Arphaxad and Selah. As we keep going down and down this timeline, we finally get to Terah and Abraham. Now here's the important part. We know some things about Abraham outside of the Bible. We know from archaeological evidence about the time that he lived. We have some archaeological sites that we think are connected to Abraham. I've personally been there as part of a deployment in Iraq. And it is that anchor, this anchor right here, knowing some things about Abraham and that he lived around 1998 BC to 1898 BC, that we can then backtrack all this chain of logic from when Abraham was born and when he lived and died, all the way back through this chain of ancestry, up through Noah, up through Enos, up through Seth, and all the way back to Adam. So we start here on Abraham, do the math to arrive at this date of 4004 BC. Now it's important to point out that this logical argument only gives us a date and a time frame for when Adam was created. There are many people that argue that there's a long period of time, sort of this gap between the first couple of verses in Genesis that seems to allow for longer time ranges of Earth history or the history of the universe. I don't think that's the case, mainly because of what Jesus says in Mark 10:6. He says, "But from the beginning of creation, God made them male and female." So I interpret Jesus' words as Adam was there right in the beginning. Now, let's recap how we got here. We looked at the data coming from Genesis chapter 5 and some later chapters of Genesis that bring us all the way to Abraham. We applied some logic about when a father begat a son and how many years that he lived, what age was that person when he had his son, and just applied some simple math. From that point to connect the chain from Adam all the way to Abraham. Abraham is connected through other historical evidence, archaeological records, things like that. And so that is how we get our timeline of creation.